attacking critical infrastructure like fuel pipelines and water supplies and hospitals, things we really can't live without. That's supposed to be America's bright line when it comes to cyber attacks. That's what President Biden meant when he said we reserve the right to respond decisively when that line is crossed. Well, now we have just learned about a new ransomware attack by apparently a Russia-based criminal group on the very critical infrastructure that is our food supply. The company that's been hit this time is an Iowa-based farming cooperative called New Cooperative. Among other things, they say they provide feed for 11 million farm animals in this country. Their computer systems were hit on Monday, hit yesterday. Now they are operating with pen and paper. Well, if the U.S. were to respond decisively here, since this bright line has been very overtly crossed, what would that actually mean? I mean, I'm not the world's techiest person. If there's a piece of technology that can't be fixed by restarting it, I'm sort of out of luck. But luckily for us, yesterday, a very distinguished computer scientist named 𝙍𝙪 𝙨𝙨, who's best known as the co-founder of the cybersecurity company CrowdStrike, he published an op-ed in the New York Times explaining what it might mean for America to really go on offense in these matters. He laid out a proposal for America targeting ransomware criminals and these hacking groups essentially in the same way that they targeted ISIS online, including disrupting their financial structures, but also revealing personal details about the perpetrators, taking down their servers, introducing bugs into their code so that even when they think they're operating on their own terms, they're actually operating on ours. It's an aggressive proposal from 𝙍𝙪 𝙨𝙨. We contacted the former Homeland Security cyber chief, Chris Krebs, about Mr. 𝙨𝙨's proposals for how the U.S. should be handling these issues now. He told us that what 𝙨𝙨 is recommending is basically that the U.S. should, quote, release the hounds against these criminal groups. I have to tell you, as far as we can tell, Mr. Krebs meant that in a good way. He meant that as a compliment. Joining us now is 𝙍𝙪 𝙨𝙨. He's chairman of a cybersecurity think tank called the Silverado Policy Accelerator. He's the co-founder of the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike. Mr. 𝙨𝙨, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Am I right to suggest that you think that America has the skills to be more aggressive, to act offensively toward these criminal groups in a way that would be much more destructive to them, but we have until now reserved those sort of skills for international terrorist groups and not applied it as aggressively as we could towards groups like this?
Well, there's no question that we have the skills. We have stood up Cyber Command well over a decade ago, which has thousands of military personnel working for them at Fort Meade, Maryland, engaging in cyber attacks in other nations, specifically what we gave them billions of dollars to do. Unfortunately, we currently use that capability primarily to go after nation states, go after terrorist groups. We have not used them to go after criminal groups like these ransomware operators. And I think it's long past time that we do that. You know, we had this Geneva summit with President Putin, as you recall, 3 months ago. And it's pretty clear now that President Putin has not lifted a finger to try to stop these groups, most of which are operating from Russia. So it's now long past time for us to take matters into our own hands and try to get these groups shut down online, make their lives very difficult for cyber operations.
I feel like a lot of us who are sort of outside the cyber and cybersecurity world run up pretty quickly against the idea of blowback, that when we talk about defensive capabilities, hardening yourself as a target, and then you talk about offensive capabilities, going after the perpetrators of these kinds of crimes and attacks. One of the things that we hear from sort of your sector is that the potential blowback, the potential consequences of a very aggressive, offensive action is something that may be hard for us to conceptualize, maybe something that's hard for us to get our head around. How do you think about that? If we did do, if the U.S. government did do the kinds of things that you're proposing, treating these groups effectively the same way that we've treated international terrorist groups, what is the risk in terms of how they could retaliate, what the blowback might be?
Well, this concern about blowback is something that's been raised over 30 years now. Anytime that the U.S. has considered engaging in offensive cyber operations, the response has always been, oh, no, we can't do that. We have all these vulnerabilities. It's going to come back and hunt us. And of course, our adversaries have not restrained them in this way. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they've all launched a continuous flood of cyber attacks against us pretty much nonstop over the last 20 years without any concern for blowback. And empirically, when we look at the evidence over the last 20 years, cyber has not led to escalation so far. And when it comes to these groups constraining themselves, does anyone really believe that when they're going after critical infrastructure, when they're going after these food cooperatives, when they're going after Colonial Pipeline and other critical infrastructure, we're basically telling them that they get to decide what is critical and what is not critical, and they'll make the decision of whether they'll give you a ransom key for free or not. That's just unacceptable for us to give so much power to these criminals.
In terms of the Biden administration's approach to this, the types of diplomatic approaches that you're describing, including that meeting with President Putin and President Biden, where they addressed this matter directly. The Biden administration has been very focused on the idea that Russia has essentially given groups like this a place to operate from, given them safe haven, in the same way that maybe, Pakistan was allowing the Taliban to regroup, rearm, and organize across borders. And so the Afghanistan war against the Taliban was never going to be won because they always had safe haven in Pakistan across the border. The Biden administration has essentially explained that problem is similar with Russia giving these places, these groups a place to operate from. Not so much a blind eye as an encouraging wink and a nod from the Russian government. Is there any way to change the Russian government's attitude or their incentive structure around these groups, or should we see that as a lost cause?
I absolutely believe that we can. You're absolutely right. The Russian government, there's no evidence that they are involved in these attacks. However, we know that these criminal groups are operating within their borders. They're very well known to Russian law enforcement. So if President Putin wanted to do something, if he wanted to shut them down, if he wanted to arrest these individuals, or even just send them a message, hey, knock it off, you're crossing the line here, he absolutely has the capability to do so. It costs him very little politically because these are not oligarchs. These are not people that are part of his entourage. He doesn't know them personally. So these are individuals that are very easy to round up and send a very clear message to. So the question is, does he have the will to do so? And right now, so far, we have not really pressured him significantly with real threats of perhaps major sanctions against his oil and gas sector, sanctions that would really impact the Russian economy unless he gets these groups to stop. We have not done that. We've sort of asked nicely, and so far, clearly, that hasn't worked.
Next month will mark 19 years since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. This morning, the Senate committee overseeing the department held a hearing on how worldwide threats have evolved over the past 2 decades. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, FBI Director Christopher Wray, and National Counterterrorism Center Director Christine Abizaid testified on how national security has changed since the 9/11 terror attacks. CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Harris joins me now with more from the hearing. Catherine, welcome. So FBI Director Wray said the Bureau is dealing with a spike in ransomware attacks. What are we learning about the money involved and who is the target?
Well, Elaine, Director Wray's testimony really underscored 2 basic principles. Number one, that ransomware is a criminal enterprise designed to raise money. And the second is that American small and medium-sized businesses are disproportionately targeted. They are least able to defend themselves and the most likely to pay the ransom. Director Wray told lawmakers that the number of ransomware attacks spiked in 2020. It was a 300% jump over previous years, and about 2,400 entities were targeted, and they ranged from healthcare institutions to schools. So that gives you a sense, I think, of the driving edge with ransomware, which is that it's disproportionately targeting these small businesses. They're least able to pay. And in many cases, they are paying ransoms at about $300,000, Elaine.
Wow. Well, Director Wray once again emphasized what he sees as the greatest domestic threat. Here's some of what he said.
Today, the greatest terrorist threat we face here in the U.S. is from what are in effect lone actors. Because they act alone and move quickly from radicalization to action, often using easily obtainable weapons against soft targets, these attackers don't leave a lot of dots for investigators to connect, and not a lot of time in which to connect them.
Catherine, who are these actors and how are they getting radicalized?
Well, Elaine, the director testified that they divide into two buckets. The first bucket are American citizens who are radicalized by jihadist ideology. I thought it was noteworthy that Director Wray said that he was watching any developments in Afghanistan, clearly a reflection of concern that it could become a safe haven again now that the Taliban is control. Director Wray also said that he is surging resources against this ideology, specifically al-Qaeda and also ISIS. The second bucket is the domestic extremist bucket. Think about January 6th. Director Wray said the vast majority of individuals in this group have an ideology that has radicalized them, that has to do with white supremacy, racial or ethnic divisions. And I think what's noteworthy, based on my reporting here at CBS News, is that in both buckets, the mechanism for radicalization is very similar. It's a digital radicalization. It's allowing like-minded people to share the same ideas, whether they're connecting through social media or other technology, and that sort of amplifies it, and it gives them that courage and that ability to cross that threshold to violence, Elaine.
Yeah, we see a lot of people finding those like-minded folks and connecting with them with the push of a button now. How did Secretary Mayorkus explain the humanitarian crisis that we're seeing unfold on the border in Del Rio, Texas?
Well, there are really two elements to his testimony, Elaine. The first is that he addressed these images that I think many of us have seen at this point. These are images of border agents on horseback being physically abusive or using whips. The counterpoint to that is that the agents can't tell the difference visually between smugglers and those who are trying to enter the U.S. illegally. He also took a hard line of questions from Republican senators on that committee, and he was not able to tell them how many people have been apprehended at the southern border and how many of those who have entered the United States have then returned to comply with the immigration process itself. Republicans charged that however he wanted to spin it, that's their terms, all people had to do was to look at the video from Del Rio to conclude that this is a humanitarian crisis, and Republicans are blaming the Biden administration's immigration policies, Elaine.
Well, Director Wray said more law enforcement officers have been killed so far this year than in all of 2020. What else does that data show?
I found this one of the most sobering moments in the testimony today, in the sense that we've all had that perception or that feeling that the conditions on the ground have become more violent for law enforcement, but we haven't quite had that data to put it in perspective. And Director Wray said that 52 law enforcement officers had been feloniously killed. That's a legal term meaning the individual attacked the officer with an intent to harm. And Director Wray said that comes to about one officer every 5 days, and that so far in 2021, the number of law enforcement officers killed has already exceeded the total in 2020.
Disturbing to hear that. Senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge. Catherine, thank you very much.